Good afternoon and good afternoon and welcome to another one of my Dragons Dungeon Talks. This is Robert Scribbler, your fantasy and D&D scribbler, here to help you today with some home brew feat options. In this case, a home brew feat fix or tweak to the oft-used, oft-loved feat, the Great Weapon Master in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So why am I doing this? Well, this is the second video blog that I have in this series where I am working on trying to provide more options for players in a homebrew fashion. Of course, these are not official Dungeons & Dragons rules. This is just a brainstorm session where I will provide to you with options for you to use as homebrew tweaks and fixes to your game if you decide to use them. And these options and fixes and tweaks are intended to increase the variety of options available to players who like to focus on melee combat. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this is in Dungeons and Dragons in general, a lot of the new options and a lot of the power creep tends to come in the form of new spells for casters, but oftentimes martial characters, particularly fighters or paladins to a lesser degree, or rangers, can tend to get left behind a little bit with new rules updates. Certainly, there are new options for fighters in the form of subclasses, and many of these subclasses are fun to play. But I find that the iterative addition of spells in D&D in as editions progress tend to create kind of a quadratic function for players that play wizards and clerics, for example, or I guess in this edition, in 5th edition, sorcerers and bards. All classes that I love to play, as you well know, considering that, well, for those of you who've watched my Gish optimized series. But for this, we're going to look at maybe trying to expand some options for melee fighters. In our last look, we provided a tweak for the dual wielder feat, one that increased power for dual wielders, arguably one that was needed. So I encourage you to take a look at the dual wielder feat in my previous video blog, Dragons Dungeon Talk, on the dual wielder, and tell me your thoughts on it and your feedback. But for this one, we're going to take a look at Great Weapon Master. Now, does Great Weapon Master really need any fixing? I think this is a question that just needs to be asked rhetorically. Generally, Great Weapon Master is an amazing feat, and people use it to great effect in the game. So what am I doing with this feat? Why am I fiddling with it in a homebrew kind of way? And in my opinion, this particular feat, though it is amazing and provides some amazing options for players, my personal opinion is that if we want to give more love to our melee fighters in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, we might want to just tweak this feat a little bit to expand it. And in order to do that, we're going to look at the issue where Great Weapon Master can, according to the rules in Dungeons and Dragons, the official rules, can only be used with two-handed heavy weapons. And the rhetorical question that I'm going to ask is this necessary, fun, or realistic? Do we see instances in reality or fiction that we feel are realistic where people use weapons in two hands to add extra power to their strikes? And would it be worthwhile to kind of loosen the restrictions a little bit on this feat to allow some more love for people who, say, use a versatile weapon in two hands? So just a thought. As we think about this, I want to go through a couple of instances where we see people using weapons in two hands that are not considered to be heavy weapons in Dungeons and Dragons. And so in this picture here, we're looking at two individuals fighting with long swords, both using two hands on their long swords. And as we look at this, at least for me, I'm not just thinking medieval combat. I'm kind of also thinking Star Wars. Oftentimes we see lightsaber wielders wielding a lightsaber in two hands. And why would they be doing this? They would be using the extra hand to create added power, momentum, and leverage. And these are things that seem to me to be also kind of part of the Great Weapon Master feat. So what other examples in reality and fiction could we think of for people using a weapon in two hands? Well, spear wielders in general will use a weapon in two hands to add speed, leverage, and momentum. And would this also be a worthwhile thing to consider for the Great Weapon Master feat? Another item or another object that is often used in two hand to add, power, force, and momentum is the quarterstaff, which we see in both traditional fighting and in fiction to a good extent. And last of all, I want to talk about a little bit like a famous katana wielder who, and a katana could arguably be a stylized longsword, for example. And this is Musashi in a traditional painting. And famously, Musashi not only used his katana in two hands, but also used like a two-weapon fighting style as well, with a long sword and the short sword, but also carved an oar into the shape of a katana and famously fought a duel with his carved oar wielded in two hands. So what would we consider a carved oar, a potential use for the Great Weapon Master? All right, so going back to our slides, we have looked at some uses of, I guess, non-traditional and traditional weapons that are not heavy weapons in Dungeons and Dragons, but in two hands. And let's see. So just to give a basic list of what other weapons might Great Weapon Master benefit. And we already talked about the longsword. We talked about the quarterstaff. We didn't talk about the battle axe, but we see many instances both in fiction and in reality where the battle axe is used both in one and two hands. And a two-handed battle axe wielder could certainly benefit from the Great Weapon Master feat. We talked about the spear. The War Hammer is also one example. I often think of, I guess in modern fiction, I often think of Thor when I think of a Warhammer, but I guess a Warhammer would typically have maybe a longer haft than Mjolnir. But we do see Thor at times wielding Mjolnir in two hands as well. So how would we tweak the Great Weapon Master to add this benefit? And it's actually not a really hard tweak here. It's actually a very simple tweak. So what I am doing with the Great Weapon Master feat for this homebrew is making just a little change. And we are keeping the first feature of Great Weapon Master in this tweak, which is on your turn when you score a critical hit with a melee weapon or reduce a creature to 0 hit points with 1, you can make a melee weapon attack as a bonus action. So no changes at all to the first feature of Great Weapon Master in this homebrew. But we are going to tweak the second feature to read, before you make a melee attack with a versatile or heavy weapon that you are proficient with and hold in two hands, you can choose to take a -5 penalty to the attack roll. If the attack hits, you add +10 to the attack's damage. And I see a typo. Oh, no, that's not a typo. That's just a comma. So basically what we're doing with this tweak is we are expanding the Great Weapon Master feat to include versatile weapons, as long as you're using the versatile weapon in two hands. Now, is this game breaking? I don't think so. Honestly, I think it opens the door up to people who want to use a longsword more traditionally, uh, according to, say, for example, Italian martial arts with the longsword, or according to the fiction that we see in many cases. For example, Jedi in fiction, such as Obi-Wan Kenobi, who tends to use his lightsaber, which is about the length of a longsword, in two hands. So I don't believe this is game wrecking. It doesn't take anything away from the great weapon master types who use a great sword. It just gives something more to your longsword wielders, or your spear wielders, or your quarterstaff wielders, and your battle axe wielders, your Warhammer wielders, your Yikulas. I think Yikula is a versatile weapon, and so it just expands the scope of this feat to people who decide to use versatile weapons in two hands to gain this extra momentum to add the +10 to damage. And we can think of a lot of classes that might benefit from this feat now that wouldn't have otherwise. We could see a monk, say, for example, a Kensai monk, using a longsword with dexterity and great weapon master, which in my opinion would be pretty darn cool. We could see a paladin kind of taking a page from the Jedi and using a longsword in two hands, possibly taking a dip in Hexblade, just a one-level dip in Hexblade, and then using that longsword with Charisma and Great Weapon Master, which would be really fun, I think. We could just see a traditional Battle Master fighter focusing in on like a longsword or a spear or a quarterstaff or a warhammer used in two hands. And we can also see these versatile weapon users maybe switching off from time to time between using a shield and using a weapon in two hands, depending on, say, for example, how many hit points they have left. It's not as if this feat is going to preclude your use of the shield. It's just going to make you a lot better at using a versatile weapon in two hands. And I really like the versatility and options and choices that this adds to the game, particularly when we're also adding in our tweak to our dual wielder feat from the last Dragon's Dungeon talk we did. And you might wonder why I'm doing this. And yes, I am really considering using these homebrew feat fixes or tweaks for a Dungeons and Dragons game that I am running called Battlestorm Online. And this one is really heavily focused on melee combat. It takes inspiration from animes like Sword Art Online and various other animes where players are trapped in a virtual reality MMO type world setting, and they have to kind of fight their way through it in order to get out. And I really think it would be fun to add these tweaks to this kind of game. Now, I'm also co-running this game with a friend of mine, Dungeon Master Graham, over on Twitch, and I think maybe he might also be interested in using these homebrew feat tweaks for our Battlestorm Online games. So maybe, we'll see. But I also wanted to publish them for you because you might want to have a more martial focus to your games. You might want to provide more options for your melee focused players. And why not? Melee is a huge risk. And so I don't know. It's just nice to give a little reward to your players in the form of some extra choices. If they are, for example, tired of just using great swords or glaives when they decide to try and optimize their melee fighters. So thank you for joining me for our next video for Dragon's Dungeon Talk. I will be looking at a third feat tweak for the Polar Master. And again, with an eye to adding more choices and more options to our wonderful melee combatant players. So thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with you again, likely tomorrow. So we'll be seeing you soon. Thank you